So my global health brothers and sisters, it's really an honor to have you here today. It's pretty unbelievable that we've reached the final lecture for infectious diseases and epidemiology. But here we are in the UCU e-learning smart room, and I hope that this lecture is really a synthesis of things that you've experienced, things that you've studied, and things that we've wrestled through. So I said, after 28 chapters of infectious diseases and epidemiology, how do we conclude this class? Well, of course, with the fulcrum of global health. So we know that we've talked many times about this fulcrum. What about what this means? What is the fulcrum of global health? Brother Brandon?
Gender issues.
Gender issues, good. Sister Brooke, elaborate. Socioeconomic. Michaela? Good, good. So yeah, it's about gender issues and specifically around empowering women. Why, if we look at all these determinants of health that we've studied from so many different types of diseases, why do they hinge on a single fulcrum? And what does that mean? So let's remember together, right? Many of you at your practicums have been wrestling through these health disparities. Why is there such severe gender inequity in Uganda and in East Africa? What does that mean to different populations? So that's going to be our time together, really zooming in on this issue. And I want to give you kind of a warning that I wouldn't give this lecture on your first day in Uganda. So at the risk of kind of some emotional overloading, I'm going to try to spend 45 minutes really looking at why this needs to be the fulcrum. Why this isn't just a bent that I particularly have for some emotional reason in my past, but why gender equity is the fulcrum of global health. So here was the slide that we had several weeks ago. It was when we did nutrition, and we said, what was our first triangle of malnutrition? What are its cause and effect relationships? Yeah, perfect. So whether you start with malnutrition, or you start with a decreased immunity, or you start with infectious diseases, the three are constantly interrelating to each other. More infectious disease, more malnutrition, more immune suppression, more infectious diseases. So and what were some of the factors that we said mattered? What are links? What's the direct immediate cause of malnutrition? You're not having enough food, right? So if we grab this and just pull that down, oh, there it goes. It's coming somehow. There you go. So if we don't have enough food, if we have deficient intake of food, then you get malnutrition. So when you took Nutrition 101 your freshman year, or you're taking nutrition in high school or middle school, it was like, you need to have the right foods. And they taught you about macronutrients and micronutrients, and as long as you had all the pieces of the puzzle, you shouldn't have malnutrition. But it got more complicated. Especially because I pushed on the screen too hard. I just need the right components. I need micro and macronutrients. We can do that. Let's do the pieces. But what was the second thing? Tell me what poor household food security means to you after living in rural Uganda, after being in Uganda for 3 months. What does that mean? Lindsay, let me hear your voice.
Your food goes bad and you don't eat it, but you have it.
Good, so there's a preservation issue, right? There's no refrigeration. What else? Grant.
Like having it out exposed and the chickens just come eat it up and then you still end up cooking it in it.
Nice, yeah. Jordan.
Having a food supply dependent on weather patterns.
Excellent. What else?
Only
Elise.
having certain nutrients during certain parts of the year, like mangoes, during mango season.
Perfect. Yeah, so seasons, climate, food storage, food availability, all of these things affect your food security. So it's not just about knowledge of having the right foods. How do you keep those foods? And as we've talked about in northern Uganda, they have 6 months of dry season. So for an adult to not have vegetables or fruits half of the year will not end their life. It will inhibit their immune system. But for a child under the age of 5, it can be devastating and life-threatening. So, it got more complicated. It's not just the pieces of the food, now it's our food security. Well then, what comes next? Now it's this infection piece. We've learned that without winter and without extreme summer, equatorial Africa is a perfect incubation for so many pathogens and microorganisms. You've talked with your host families about how many times they have malaria in a year. When do they have typhoid fever? Some of you have personally partook of typhoid fever. There's a lot of infections in this environment. Then it gets more complicated. Then we start to look at sanitation. How does the roads affect the water? How does plumbing or the lack of plumbing affect sanitation? At first we thought as long as we could build a pit latrine, that should reduce cholera and infectious diseases, right? But then we learned, what else do we have to do with that pit latrine? It's got to be covered, or else all these vectors are flying down to sample the microorganisms, and then they're coming straight for your food, for your utensils, and then they're going to share that with you. Then, just because it wasn't complex enough, now literacy, education levels, awareness, availability of health infrastructure, all of these things are affecting the cycle of malnutrition, infectious disease, and poverty. But this is the slide where we said the fulcrum, the center place of this whole thing is gender issues. So yes, socioeconomics are critical. Yes, hospitals are essential. Yes, education and literacy, all these things are important. But gender equity, the role and empowerment of women, is the fulcrum, the balancing point. Those stones that are balanced that global health hinges on. So I cannot let you leave Uganda without this passing from your mind to your heart to your soul. That it's not just one area of grad school. It's not just your specialty. This is for physiotherapy. This is for occupational therapy. This is for medicine. This is for surgery. This is for nursing. This is the balance point of global health. So this is pretty humbling, right? Because when I think about balance and fulcrum, I think about my beautiful 10-year-old daughter when we get to go home to Colorado where she was born every July, and we go to the river stones and we balance these stones with her grandfather and with I. And it's exciting and it's challenging. When they think about balancing heavy things, they think about what it is every single morning when they wake up, when they have to get water. This is a Piru gift. This is a sister of mine from Yumbe. She's a teacher. She has an excellent job. She works for the government. She's very highly trained. But every single morning before she gets to go teach and prepare her lessons, she carries 20 liters of jerry can on her head. So this balance, this fulcrum, has really profound implications for us and for the future. So we saw that the World Health Report, we've learned about all these different diseases. We covered respiratory diseases. We covered gastrointestinal. Underlying hidden cause between each of these is that 53% of all deaths globally are from malnutrition. It's a hidden figure that's not seen and not captured very well because we chart their diseases. We chart what you can see in the slides, and we miss the true cause. So we went through this slide and talked about this really painful cycle of how if a woman is malnourished, then she is statistically more likely to have a baby in a pregnancy, and that child will have a low birth weight. And children that are born with low birth rates, they have impaired mental development. They have a higher mortality rate. That leads to more infections. That causes child stunting. And child stunting causes physical and cognitive deficits for life. Right? So what's our window? How many days? 1,000 days. 1,000 days is from what? Conception to 2 years of age. So you have a 1,000-day window from the moment of conception. Even in Western countries, it's impossible to know that moment of conception. And then, from that moment, from conception to the age of 2, if the cycle of malnutrition is not stopped, there will be permanent, lifelong cognitive deficits, cognitive and physical. That puts adolescent girls at extreme risk of early pregnancy. So child stunting causes a very big deficit of effects from girls to boys. That leads to adolescent stunting for women that is statistically correlated with younger pregnancies, earlier marriages, forced marriages, and earlier pregnancies. And then I'll show you some statistics about maternal mortality and morbidity rates as we go. So this essential aspect of the fulcrum links us to something we haven't spoken about in these past 3 months, and that is the topic of vulnerable populations. When you hear the word vulnerability, what do you think could make individuals vulnerable? Irene, what do you think?
In a society that may be too patriarchal, I feel like women are a lot of the times victims of sexual violence, of domestic abuse.
Yep.
So women.
Yep. Perfect. If you don't, let's tease it apart. So why? Why would any population become vulnerable? Sophie.
I think there's like an intersection of powerlessness. So a population that has specific vulnerabilities, like specific to their experience, and they don't have the power to get out of their situation.
Nice. Perfect. Jordan.
I mean, what comes to mind is like anyone that completely relies on someone else for their basic needs, like someone that can't wash themselves, can't feed themselves, someone that like can't get themselves dressed, like someone that needs someone else.
Yes. Excellent. So all these power dynamics are linking to autonomy, your ability to make decisions for yourself. The WHO defined vulnerability as the degree to which a population, an individual, or an organization is unable to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the impacts of a disaster. You might not notice the vulnerability when the day is going well, but it's when something happens, a landslide, a drought, a war, some other disruption, then these vulnerabilities are exposed. And as I was saying, vulnerable populations are those whose ability to exercise autonomous decisions is restricted. Vulnerable people as those who are relatively or absolutely incapable of protecting their own interests because they may have insufficient power, intelligence, education, resources, strength, or other needed attributes. So this comes from a public health nursing textbook. And I think this really helps us to see the role of vulnerability has so many different determinants. Disabilities, they could be physical, they could be mental, socioeconomics, education, culture, all of these things cause different populations to have different types of vulnerability. So, this textbook of nursing community health differentiates these really nicely. It says, special protection refers to a measures taken to remove the obstacles restricting the subject's ability to exercise autonomous decision making. So, oftentimes there's criticism that vulnerability is too broad. They're saying, you can't, say 50% of humanity is vulnerable, and therefore women can't be vulnerable, because that's just too broad. Or it becomes too narrow, very, very exclusive and kind of hyper myopic determination of vulnerability. And these can lead to stereotyping individuals. So these categories I think will be helpful to you. There's cognitive vulnerability, which is based on understanding. There's juridic vulnerability, which has to do with legal rights. So we talked about this in the nutrition unit, that if a woman has a land title, then her children are 80% less likely to have acute malnutrition. Like a land title, it doesn't matter how much land. It's just if she owns land. That's showing the legal rights that if she has a land title, her children are 80% less likely to have acute malnutrition. Differential vulnerability, medical vulnerability, allocational vulnerability, infrastructural vulnerability. So tease these out. See how some of them overlap. We're constantly talking about these Venn diagrams, right? How do all these things affect each other? We're going to see that there are individuals that are in the center of this Venn diagram. And there are many vulnerable populations that might only be affected by one type of vulnerability. Children, pregnant women, elderly people, malnourished people, and people who are ill or immunocompromised. So this was more recent, published this year, 2019, by the WHO, and it's giving us more insights into vulnerability. These people are particularly vulnerable when a disaster strikes, and it takes a relatively high share of the disease burden due to these emergencies. And of course, socioeconomics. Poverty and its common consequences such as malnutrition, homelessness, poor housing, and destitution is a major contributor to vulnerability. So this is really interesting. This was published by the UNICEF, and they're looking at total number of births on planet Earth based on different regions in the world. And UNICEF predicts that at 2050 will be the first time that Africa has the largest number of births. More than India and China combined, there'll be more births on the continent of Africa. This is really important for our implications of global health, because we know about the disparities of health that exist in sub-Saharan Africa today, when the vast majority of births, the highest majority of births, is in Asia. So before we get into the really devastating figures, I wanted to get some hopeful optimism. So let me say as loud and as clearly as possible that the world is becoming a better place. We are making great progress for positive change. So looking at the under 5 mortality rates in Africa from 1990 to 2017, reduced by 58%. Mortality rates for children 5 to 14 in Africa for 27 years, reduced by 54%. So these are awesome statistics. You could see here in gray the 1990 figures. If we look at East Africa, we had under 5 mortality being 168 births out of every 1,000. That is just unbelievable. That means 16 out of every 100 children did not make it to their 5th birthday. 16. And that's 1990, right? That's just on the edge of your lifetime. Now, in 2017, East Africa is 58. 58 out of 1,000 births. So now, 5.8 out of every 100 children. Massive improvement. Amazing improvement. Let's look at this statistic is looking at the older children from 5 to 14. So in East Africa, it was the highest of all regions of Africa in 1990, with 46 out of every 1,000 children dying between the age of 5 to 14. And then in 2017, it dropped down to 13. So amazing positive metrics. We are making a positive change, right? I'm always trying to work this balance between being a super optimistic person that loves to smile and loves to encourage all of you and loves to tell you about how great your future is going to be as a global health legend, balanced with we need to open our eyes to the level of health disparities and to the need for collaborative care, right? The only way to impact the future of global health is if we all do it together. So this is a different set of metrics. This was published in Lancet. We remember our Lancet journal from our brother Wakefield, who has caused some issues in our lives. But published last year was looking at national and regional under 5 mortality rates by economic status for low-income and middle-income countries. So again, it's phenomenal. We can see different parts of Africa and the world, from Eastern Europe, West and Central Africa, and the trend is as clear as day, right? Under 5 mortality rates are dropping everywhere in every region of Earth. We're doing a good job. Okay, but the deep breath. Action is still critical, and especially for global maternal health. Maternal mortality is unacceptably high, and we can't just pat ourselves on the back and say, we've done good, now let's go back to life as usual. The vast majority of maternal deaths, 94% of moms that die in childbirth or in the time period around childbirth were in low resource settings. And according to the WHO, most of those deaths could have been prevented. We're not talking about these strange genetic abnormalities of the pelvic inlet and that the baby was going to be trapped no matter what. We're talking about 94% of maternal deaths being preventable. In sub-Saharan Africa and southern Asia, 86% of all of Earth's maternal deaths occurred in these two regions in 2017. Sub-Saharan Africa was 2/3 of all maternal deaths, and southern Asia was 1/5. So these statistics are really important. There have been countries that are designated kind of with our highest priorities, and I'll let you read about that. The high number of maternal deaths in some area of the world is showing this inequity. It's showing that this isn't biological, it isn't genetic, this is tied to this thing that I call the fulcrum of health. So when we do some comparison, it's really humbling and eye-opening. Maternal mortality rate in high-income countries is 11 out of every 100,000 births. Whereas in low-income countries, it's 462 moms out of every 100,000 births. And then these are the countries with the high alert, biggest risk area. And then this is what I was talking about with this cycle. The data is shocking. The risk of maternal mortality is the highest for adolescent girls under 15 years old and complications with pregnancy, childbirth, and especially in really young girls between 10 and 19. Women in less developed countries have on average many more pregnancies than women in developed countries, and their lifetime risk of death due to pregnancy is higher. I had to read this statistic like 5 times before my brain could understand it. This is from the WHO Maternal Health Fact Sheet published a few months ago. They're explaining that a woman, her lifetime risk of dying connected to a maternal issue when that woman is 15 years old. And let's compare 15-year-old in a developed country and a 15-year-old in a developing country. And in high-income countries, 1 out of every 5,400 15-year-olds is likely to die in her life at any time from maternal-related issues. 1 out of 5,400. But 1 15-year-old in low-income countries is likely to die out of every 45 15-year-olds in her whole life, but not from other infectious diseases, right? We're not talking about trypanosomiasis and plasmodium. We're talking about this thing called birth, about getting pregnant, a natural process. So that means 2.2% of all 15-year-olds will pass away in their lifetime from maternal issues. So this is really difficult data. Every day in 2017, approximately 810 women a day die from preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. The good news is that in the last 17 years, we've dropped the maternal mortality ratio by 38%. But this is the same data from a different source. So it's nice when your data correlates. The CDC published the same figure. 94% of all maternal deaths occur in low and lower middle income countries. So there is need in the United States of America, and we're going to start to differentiate where those needs are most acute. But remember 810 women dying per day in low and middle income countries? In the United States of America, 700 women die a year. 700. And 3 out of 5 could be prevented. Remember, so 94% of maternal mortality on Earth could be prevented. But in the United States specifically, it's 3 out of 5. 1 in 3 pregnancy-related deaths occur 1 week to 1 year after delivery, which is a big need for public health education. that it could even be a year after delivery. So really focusing on this disparity of 810 a day or 700 a year. But in the United States, 33% of mothers that pass away, it's within 1 week to 1 year of delivery. 31% is during pregnancy, and 36% it's during the actual delivery, in that delivery to 1 week window. Here's what should be eye-opening to us, right? We've been talking about how things are bad, but they're getting better. Then we get this figure. Pregnancy-related mortality in the United States from 87 to 2016. And the trend is very, very clearly getting worse. There is more pregnancy-related mortality in the United States. How could that be? I thought we had like iPhones and Amazon. What do you guys think? Why would there be more pregnancy-related maternal deaths in the United States? Did our technology change? Are we reducing numbers of hospitals? Between 87 and 2016, do you think ambulances have faster response rates or slower response rates? Faster. Why? Vulnerable populations. The fulcrum of global health, whether you're in the United States, whether you're in Germany, whether you're in Uganda, anywhere on earth, it's always going to come to this fulcrum. So what could that be? This is data showing the actual causes, whether it's hemorrhage, infections, thrombosis, hypertensive. You can read that data. But here comes the vulnerability. Of those deaths, 13% of them were in white women. 30% were in Native Americans and Alaska Native women. And 41% were in black women. So we know that the percent of Native individuals in the United States is very low, less than 10% of the US population, and yet 30% of pregnancy-related deaths. So vulnerable populations can be found in every single city on earth, and that it needs to be our focus. This really exposes it further and further. So this is looking at different time periods from 2007, 2009, 11, 13, 15 by racial ethnic background. Pregnancy-related deaths by race. And we're seeing that Black Americans have twice to 3 times the higher risk of death in childbirth. Right? We're not talking about scary carcinomas or these other factors. We're talking about pregnancy. We're talking about delivering babies. So, and then with Native populations coming very close behind Black American populations. So now focusing on neonatal mortality. Over 22,000 infants died in the US in 2017, and the 5 leading causes of death were birth defects, preterm birth weight, pregnancy complications, SIDS, and other injuries. So you'll learn more about sudden infant death syndrome, which is SIDS. It's very closely correlated to these injuries, such as accidental suffocation. So this is looking at the United States by different regions and seeing these different risk factors. I always have to give a shout out to my birth state, right? Least obese state in the United States, also the lowest infant mortality rate. But we have lots of things we have to work on. So the data for children isn't double and 3 times like it is for mothers, but it's still statistically significant. So if non-Hispanic Black babies are 11.4% of the neonatal. There's 11.4 children that die before the age of 5 out of every 1,000 births, compared to Asian children, which are 3.6. So that's 3 times increased likelihood of death before the age of 5 in the United States of America. Now when we look at the highest national under 5 mortality rates of all of Earth, we quickly see that Sub-Saharan Africa is going to be our area of concern. So our beloved Uganda is in the 40 to 75 births out of every 1,000. So this was a lot of data. It's incredible how much is out there on the UNICEF website. It was published in September of 2019. And they're looking at specifically the 137 low to middle income countries. So my first thing was like, well, how many countries are there even in the world, right? Everyone has a different figure. So the United Nations recognizes 195 countries. But the Olympics has 206 different countries. And FIFA has 211. So interesting data. But this is looking at 137 lowest and middle income countries, right? Out of the 195. And we see that in 2016, all 137 of those lower countries, there was 64.6 deaths out of every 1,000 births. So that again is just unbelievably too high. So 6%, 6 out of every 100 children won't make it to the age of 5. And here's where we can compare Uganda being with this, the mean data of 33 compared to Rwanda, which is 27, and in Egypt with 18 is their middle number. Then Mexico with 10, and then you have the UK doing quite a bit better than the United States. So 3.6 children out of every 1,000 births compared to 5.6 in the US. But when you zoom back and just think about for 137 countries, it's 64 out of every 1,000 births. So this brings us to this maternal child health. So many of your practicums have connected to this and had contact with this. But the heart of maternal child health lies in the goals to create health equity, promote social justice, and understand the social determinants of health. Thank you, Dr. Wendy Hellerstedt, right? She's on to this fulcrum. So 2019 data published by the CDC said that there's 34 million displaced people on Earth today, and 80% of them are 80% of the women and children are vulnerable. So if it helps us, I think this data really helps us to see that it's not the X chromosomes, it's not estrogen, it's vulnerability. The more vulnerable you are, the higher the effect of health disparities. But 34 million people are displaced in the world due to war and refugee situations, and 80% are women and children who are vulnerable to abuse, negative health outcomes, and many more. So the top 4 things brought to light by the CDC are that we need to ensure safe pregnancies and deliveries. We need to meet family planning needs. We need to prevent and treat STIs and HIV. And we have to respond and prevent gender-based violence. So USAID published a really interesting article evaluating reproductive health assessment for conflict-affected women. This is looking at the 80% of the 34 million people. And their conclusions were that millions of pregnant women, new mothers, and children experience severe illness or death each year, largely from preventable or treatable causes. Almost all maternal and child deaths, 99% according to the CDC, in less developed regions and in Africa being hit the hardest. So the US government is doing what they can, and they've been doing what they can to focus on maternal child health for 50 years. And the total US funding for maternal child health and nutrition reached $1.36 billion in 2019. So when you look at some of these figures, it's just unbelievable. So the CDC says 28% of maternal deaths are from diseases that complicate pregnancy, such as malaria, anemia, and HIV. And another third of maternal deaths are from severe bleeding. So by attacking, postpartum hemorrhage and infectious diseases, you could tackle 60% of maternal mortality rates. And then they say, with the percentage of pregnant women receiving recommended minimum number of 4 antenatal care visits, we've done all that we can to get women to get antenatal care. But currently in the whole continent of Africa, only 52% of women in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia see a doctor or a clinician or a midwife 4 times before delivery. So let's look at this data. Look at what the US government's doing. So this is US funding for maternal and child health. You have just MCH down here in the bottom, and then you have specifically, they started allocating funds towards nutrition starting in 2009. And these are in millions. So you go from $872 million given by the US to try to tackle maternal child health, and $55 million for nutrition. And then 10 years later, it's up to $1.2 trillion for maternal child health and $145 million for nutrition. So this is a priority. So the WHO is going to help us, right? Because so far I've just been pouring data of suffering and struggle. And the WHO says the suffering of all this data that we've talked about is not inevitable. Most of the environment-related diseases and deaths can be prevented using effective, low-cost, and sustainable tools and strategies. And the WHO has created a Healthy Environments for Children Alliance. And this HECA, if you will, is dedicating to trying to make the world hecka better. So their core priorities are to ensure advocacy and awareness raising, provide knowledge, promote effective policies, and support countries and communities to maintain healthy environments for children, and then evaluate the progress. So this is the textbook I was telling you about, Public Health Nursing. And in the textbook, they say, global health is not just a global public health agenda. It does not begin and end with an individual. It must consider all factors within a country that affect health, like environment, education, policies, healthcare, access, economics, war, public safety, right? So I hope this rings true to our very first time together ever in K3, when we were like, what is global health? What are we doing here, right? And we talked about how it's legal, it's nursing, it's medicine, it's advocacy, it's education, and it crosses international borders. So what's eye-opening is that despite the presence of very well-meaning organizations, less than 5% of the needed healthcare costs for developing countries are provided by NGOs and international programs combined. Less than 5%. The biggest stark reality of this underfunding that I've seen in my short time of being in Uganda is this year with the lack of funding for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So you've heard, you only have to sit with me for about 3 minutes and you're going to hear about Yumbe, you're going to hear about the largest refugee settlement on the continent of Africa, and that Uganda is the largest host to refugees in the continent. But this year, there's a massive funding deficit. So if you just think in your mind, like, what would be a bad deficit of funding? Maybe, if they had half of the funding they needed, that would be a big problem because the funding needed is in billions. But it's worse than half. What if it was 25%? That'd be devastating, but it's worse. What if it was 5% of the needed funding? It's worse. The funding right now is at 4% of what UNHCR requires for Uganda. 4%. So, and I haven't had a chance to talk with you guys about some of what led to this devastating figure. There was some conspiracy theorists that were saying Uganda is only welcoming to refugees for their own monetary gain. That it must be the government. Have you guys heard that from any of your UCU friends? People criticize the government. Well, you welcome in refugees just because you're trying to coat your own pockets. And then there was a widespread belief that the numbers of refugees weren't accurate, that they were exaggerated. So then a multi-million-dollar intervention had to be laid out, where for the first time in Uganda's history, which has been hosting refugees for more than 50 years, they now do biometric scans of every single refugee. Retina scans and biometric fingerprinting, because there was this conspiracy that there's not that many refugees. They're lying about the numbers. And that happened in 2018. And sure enough, they had predicted that Bidi Bidi, the largest host of refugees, the data they had was that it was at 280,000 refugees in one single settlement. After they did the data, in biometric scanning, it was 268,000 refugees. So there was a deficit of 12,000. But they quickly showed that refugees in Uganda are allowed to move. So if the wife was registered in a different settlement and the husband was registered in this settlement, and 2 years after a horrific war, they reunited, someone could move to another settlement. So that deficit was very small. But in the next year, Uganda is now the lowest funded country that UNHCR works in. So it's just so heartbreaking, the effects of these struggles. So the World Food Program said, recent reports indicate that the majority of funds raised by international organizations are used for food relief, worker training, and disaster relief, but it meets less than 5% of the needed health infrastructure. So this is trying to bring this all together. What is the relationship between gender equity and sustainable development? Well, the United Nations Development Program is talking about this very issue. And reports that they've done that were published in 2016 stated that when gender inequality increases by just 1%, so if the gender balance is off 1%, then the country's human development decreases by 0.75%. So it's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. As inequality rises, development drops. Then they published that the gender gap even costs sub-Saharan African economies up to $105 billion per year, Yes, Brandon.
Question. What is like the measurement when it says gender equality or inequality?
That's a great question. It's a great question. I don't have the whole metrics of this study memorized, but it's one we should look into. They looked at like women's participation and representation in leadership as one factor. They looked at decision-making positions, like do women have equity in those, and peacefulness. But I think there were more metrics, not just positions held. But these figures are really, really strong. If women participate in the economy identically to men, the global GDP would increase by up to 28 trillion. So I think this harkens back to when we were talking about Ackerman and what it means in our liberation theology, that if any population is overly vulnerable and overly susceptible, it has devastating effects for all of society. So this is a study published in 2019 that was looking specifically at areas of war or refugee issues and how it unequally affects women. So when there's a violent conflict like South Sudan, that increases mortality and morbidity for women. It has an indirect impact on women's health. It increases numbers of widows. It causes sexual and gender-based violence. It causes migration and displacement, especially of women, and loss of assets for women. That's the first initial gender inequity moment. They call it first round. But the second round of impacts occur over years. And there's changes to marriage and fertility, political and civic participation, labor reallocation, and children as human capital. So this was a really interesting study that's just looking at when war happens, how does it affect men and women differently? This was a study done specifically on Uganda, experiences of gender-based violence among refugee populations in Uganda, published last year. And the findings of this study said gender-based violence is endemic in peripheral, hard-to-reach, conflict and post-conflict settings than in more stable communities due to underreporting, concealment, and that's associated with numerous capacity challenges for access and utilization of services. The extreme conditions that refugees go through during displacement, flight, resettlement tend to exacerbate and sustain gender-based violence. Gender-based violence can have almost inestimable short and long-term negative health consequences. And a disregard for one's own well-being is only one of the many potential devastating effects, which also include infertility among female survivors. Their last conclusion was addressing extreme conditions that refugees encounter before and during flight, how they're resettled, and providing the basic needs, especially for social services, working with cultural leaders, should be central to the design and implementation of gender-based violence prevention, detection, and response. Okay, we're almost there. So the WHO in 2015 came up with a new data metric. So I don't know if you've heard of old terms from the 90s like the first world and the third world. And then there was the global north and the global south. And then, Eastern world, Western world. There's all these different terms that everyone uses, developing, developed. But in 2015, the WHO said, let's try to come up with a statistical correlation that predicts why health is higher in some areas and why health is lower. And those three predictors are income, socioeconomics, fertility rates, and education. And I think this is helpful because we have so much data hitting us all the time. And this is called the SDI, the Socio-Demographic Index, to compare populations. So once you know the SDI, then now we've gone through all of the hard data. I'm not gonna hit you with any more depressing numbers. Now we're gonna talk about how to move forward. So there's something we haven't talked about, and it's called global health diplomacy. This is also a nursing public health term. I think this is powerful because it correlates to the USP principle of mutually beneficial partnerships, right? This is public health nursing terms for MBP. So in this textbook, they say global health diplomacy refers to a multi-level, multi-factor negotiation process that involves the environment, health, diseases, and safety. It's now recognized that to solve global health problems, one must build capacity for global health diplomacy. So when we think about a diplomat negotiating a trade across international troubled waters, now a global health or a global health diplomacy is looking at negotiating health issues across power imbalances. So, I would love to hear from a few people. Do you think you've seen that negotiation across power imbalances occur at your practicum sites? How have you seen that? What are some examples you can think of? So, global health diplomacy, right? Utilizing a collaborative teamwork and framework to overcome power imbalances that affect health.
The one that I can think of is just with the and how their team works with the elderly that a lot of times just don't have access to or are,
Keep going.
Deal with the bottom side of the power balance. Like they're, whether it's lack of money, resource, or they just have to do other things, they can't take care of themselves.
Okay, that's good on. Riley?
You see like the World Vision partnership at Chiru?
Good.
Africa and how they're working on that to get like more water care. Would that be a good example?
Yeah, because that involves funding and access and resources. Caleb?
And now the LUM, a lot of the clinics they do are kind of like working with the external powers, and then they kind of do it together, like the external powers funding them, but then it's kind of being run by Uganda too.
Nice. And that's huge because it's a big hospital. So most hospital clinicians aren't going to see themselves as global health diplomats, but you're seeing it. Yeah, it's built into the framework. Sophie?
At Omnimed, a lot of the VHTs who train in their villages about different health topics are women. And so to have Omnimed support the women who have been put in positions of leadership is really important because the villages can see that these women are trusted and they have this really valuable information for the villages. And so every time we go for a home visit or a quarterly training, the villages see that these women who are leaders in their community are, like, they're able to be trusted. They have a lot of information that they can give to their communities.
Excellent. Yeah, I think there's so many layers that apply to each of your practicum site, and it's good to try to pull all those out. So the textbook, Public Health Nursing, says when and if projects are developed in a way that pays attention to global health diplomacy, there will be an improvement in the overall health status of a population. And that secondarily can contribute to economic growth. And it causes reduction in production loss. It causes an increase in the use of natural resources. It causes an increase in the number of children who can attend school and then participate in the country economic growth. It increases monetary resources. We also saw this in our first week together when the Uganda Ministry of Health, the way they motivated hand washing was not saying it'll decrease your infectious diseases. What did the Uganda Ministry of Health say? Hand washing helps you save money. It helps you save money. It helps you save time. Now you don't have to go to the hospital. So tying health to economics is a big part of diplomacy, global health diplomacy. So I think one of the most powerful quotes of this public health nursing textbook is this quote: "Provision of health services alone will not ease a country's healthcare plight." Right? Even if you can get bed nets, even if you can have skilled obstetricians there, without a bridge, without a mutually beneficial partnership that can link vulnerable people to access, then those services are utilized. Those services are actualized, and the world becomes a better place. So, as I said, we just endured more than an hour of painful facts and accounts of suffering. The legend of Paul Farmer once said, "Poverty and powerlessness and untreated disease are hell on earth, and there is nothing God-given about such conditions. They are man-given. It is easy to look at the world and to lose hope. Can we live? Can we move forward without hope?" So these are principles that USP has prayerfully considered and tried to interweave throughout Faith in Action and all of your courses. And Corinthians 13:13, there are three things that remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. So let me tell you what's kept Avery and I in this work, right? How are we facing this data? How are we navigating the dependents and those that knock on our door day after day? How do we take our daughter to school in Kampala day after day? How do we navigate these dynamics? Faith, hope, and love. This picture was taken in May in 2019 during the Advanced Nutrition module with Global Health students. And this is the very church made of mud and a grass-thatched roof that Avery and I have had the blessing to worship in since 2003. And the church is full. Wall to wall. And what do you see? You see these women smiling, worshiping, bringing their children to church. The church is 90% women. And you see hope, you see faith, you see love. We have to keep our eyes open to the data, and then we have to enter into this reality, or else we'll be crushed. This is also in May. This is one of the 10 women's savings groups that the Mango Project works with. Every week, the Mango Project is meeting with these women who are saving their pennies and their Ugandan shillings one at a time, encouraging each other, learning about health. And look at these faces. Such powerful lives. Lives of transformation. What's helped me so much over the years is there's times that I just want to be so devastated and so broken. And it has been my relationships with my Ugandan brothers and sisters that say, keep going, It's okay. God is good. And I want to feel so bad, and I'm struggling with disparities and inequities and how it doesn't make sense. But when they tell me of God's love, of God's goodness, of God's faithfulness, then I realize I can't cop out. I can't just give up because it's too hard for me. When my brothers and sisters are being agents of change, they're being global health diplomats. That empowers me. That keeps me going. There was a woman who lived in slums and spent her life with poor people, and her name's thrown around too much. And we forget the weight of what it means to live in a slum for your whole life. And she said, we can do no great things, only small things with great love. So I said this when we started. The only hope for global health is if we go together. This is Dede. She's about 88 years old. She's never had a birth certificate, so we're not exactly sure. She's my host brother's aunt. She's the only one of her generation still alive, because his grandparents have died, his parents have died, but his aunt is still living. She's been 100% blind for about 16 years, and she is so full of faith, hope, and love. And you can see her here greeting Avery. Avery's Lugbara name is Aya. And it's the name of Dede's mother. So being welcomed into a community when you don't deserve to be welcomed in, and getting this chance to work together is so profound. So the Mango Project is very small. These are little vegetable seeds. These are cucumbers and tomatoes. And together, hand in hand, we can fight against all of the inequities to try to keep the fulcrum of global health stable. So, I just really appreciate you guys joining in to global health this whole semester. It's been so amazing to journey together, and I hope that we can journey together, because with all of my mind and my heart and my soul, I believe that as women rise, malnutrition falls. So I wanted to end with some happiness, and I want you to hear Dede's voice. So on International Women's Day last year, we made this small video. And I might need Brother Mark's help. So this is not one of our most professional videos. It's just a video that Avery and I did totally on our own with an iPhone, just interviewing amazing women that are involved with the Mango Project. And it starts with Kathy Nafula, who is a UCU graduate. She's an honors college alumni. And she has been an intern at the Mango Project twice. Now she works in Fort Portal in an amazing study with refugees. So, just 2 minutes. I hope you enjoy.
My name is Catherine Nafula, and I am a loving and independent Ugandan woman.
My name is Kay Rose. I am born in Sudan. That is my village, and I am a strong woman and a beautiful woman.
Maruro Kiae, ma oko Uganda ni Otobe.
I'm Chandru Agnes, and I'm a beautiful Ugandan woman.
Ma Rijota Arsha ma oko Uganda ni ma Otobe.
My name is Apiru Gift, a strong Ugandan woman.
Samira Moko Uganda ni Mazingo Kwabe.
You are nearly the happiest woman in Uganda.
Marute Karai Mae, Manga Margwa Village Ga, Paris Joke, Mau Kwabe, Azingata Uganda.
My name is Bakosina. I'm a beautiful Ugandan woman. My Patopira Marciasa and if I am go Korean village Ga, after I was found to deliver. I would on to this year, in Addisi, all my Emma Fu Kwasu, Papa in the last, Tirama Bangala.
I was for Ma Rusi, Alamanga Amalia, Yoku, Rodra. I was for Uganda, Ediba Mani, Moke Fejo, Dunia di Gadarisi.